StoryCon presents Backstory, a podcast featuring writers, readers, and their stories, hosted by best-selling author Jennifer A. Nielsen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Backstory podcast. I am so thrilled that you found us, and especially thrilled today because this week's guest is somebody that my family has grown up with as a huge fan, and that we have followed this author's career for so long. And so I'm going to try to keep myself in check and not over fangirl on this one. Christopher, welcome to the Backstory podcast.
Thanks for having me here. I have to say it was pretty surreal hearing you recount a version of my personal history. I thought you did a lovely job of that, but hearing it coming from someone else when I've told that story so many times was pretty wild.
Yeah, it is different when, we as authors, we are owners of our own stories until somebody else is reading it. And to that end, I want to give a very brief bio for you for the 2 or 3 people on planet Earth who may not be familiar with you. And so Christopher Paolini is the author of the international bestsellers Eragon, Eldest, Brissinger, and Inheritance, as well as The Fork, The Witch, and the Worm. Murtagh is now available and marks the highly anticipated return to the world of Eragon. His debut science fiction novel, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, came out in September 2020, and its prequel, Fractal Noise, was released in May of 2023. Christopher resides in Paradise Valley, Montana, in the United States. Christopher, I have to show you this because this is why it's such a big deal. This is my son's copy of Eragon. This is from 2005. And I know for me as an author, seeing a much loved and used copy is always such a big deal. This has traveled through my entire family. This is part of our family's history.
No, I love seeing well-loved copies like that. In fact, to the point where I once went to our local library and swapped out, I didn't tell them I was doing this, but I stole their copy of Eragon off their shelves because it was a bit dog-eared. So I gave them a new copy, and I stole the dog-eared copy and brought it home. So I had a version that actually looked like it had been read, which it's one of my favorite little artifacts.
Oh, absolutely. Which makes me want to ask this question, which I hadn't planned to ask, but since you kind of admitted to having stolen that or swapped it from the library, have you ever sneak signed one of your books where they don't know, the bookstore, the library doesn't know you're there, and you just kind of sneak a signature inside it?
Oh yeah, I do that all the time, especially in airport bookstores if they have my books. So I'll usually put something up on X/Twitter just to let my fans know that, hey, you might want to poke around, here, and you might find a signed copy. I actually once signed a copy of the Da Vinci Code by accident, but that was just because I was signing a pile of my books and I wasn't paying attention, and I went right into a pile of his books that was underneath mine. So someone out there has a copy of the Da Vinci Code signed by Christopher Paolini.
That is the coolest thing ever, because that is a completely unique thing. If you get that one, it's literally, as far as we know, the only one in existence. Yeah. So get that thing up on eBay, right? No, don't. Save it forever. It's awesome. Christopher, I loved hearing about your childhood, and I know how it must have played out for you, and how it impacted you. The way you were raised, does that show itself in your books, in your characters?
I mean, I think that's true for any writer. The fact that I was homeschooled and grew up in a pretty rural environment, and my parents were always self-employed. I mean, all of that shaped who I became, and thus, the writer I am. Especially because my mom, being a Montessori teacher, that guided my problem-solving approaches. And my mom and my dad did a lot to introduce me to fiction of various types. So I'm not sure I would have become a writer without that care and attention they put into me. Like a lot of boys, I wasn't particularly interested in reading to start with, and I had a lot of energy, and all I wanted to do was be outside playing with my friends. So in another environment with another set of parents, I think I would have not been a reader at all. Or it would have taken me a lot longer in life to become a reader.
And what did you grow up reading? What lit up your imagination?
I mean, obviously sci-fi fantasy was my preference, but, my mom was reading Dickens and Jane Austen to my sister and me when we were, 9, 10, and I was reading the Ramona books and the Tom Swift books and the Nancy Drew books and, all sorts of other stuff growing up. My introduction, though, to sci-fi fantasy kind of occurred with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Hobbit. And then modern fantasy, I was introduced via The Ruby Knight by David Eddings, which is the middle book of a trilogy, but I didn't know that at the time. And between sort of those three things, The Hobbit, the Narnia books, and then the David Eddings book, I just completely fell in love with the genre. And I fell in love with science fiction in a similar way. And it was like, yes, this is for me. Part of that, too, with fantasy might be that I grew up in a very isolated area, and fantasy helped give me a sense of, I don't know, tradition, a continuity with the past. Like, here were these modern books being written that still talked about slightly more archaic civilizations and traditions, and a lot of times the characters were outside dealing with animals and the wilderness, and that's what I was dealing with in my day-to-day. So I related to it.
All right, I adore the fact that Aragon was originally Kevin. That that is so fantastic to me. And when I first heard your story, you made the point that you don't feel that it would have been nearly what it became had it'd been
Yeah.
the epic story of Kevin. In all other ways, when you changed Aragon's name, can you talk about that process of finding his name? Did it change him as a character for you, or was Aragon always Aragon, just with a different name?
The reason he was named Kevin in the first place is because I had tried writing the story a couple times before I could figure out how to plot a book. And one of those early versions was actually set in the real world. It was about a young boy living out in the countryside who finds a dragon egg. So having him be named Kevin made sense. When I changed the setting of the story into a fantasy world, then I knew I needed a different name. I just didn't want to take the time to think of one because that was going to slow down the writing, because names are powerful. So I just wrote the whole first draft with him named Kevin, but he was still Aragon. And at the end of that draft, then I put the time and effort in to try to find that name, and it was a hard process. Took a long time to find something that felt right, and I'm lucky that I did find a name that worked.
What is your process for naming your characters? Because your character names and your place names are fabulous.
Well, thank you. Well, it really depends. I was pretty undisciplined with it when I started because I didn't quite know what I was doing. The character names seem to be something that either happen immediately. It's like you think of the right name right from the start and there's no issue with it, or you have to fight for it for a long time to really figure out what works. These days, if I'm writing in the world of Aragon, I usually am coming up with my names either from certain appropriate historical sources, usually a lot of Nordic or Germanic sources, or I'm inventing the names according to the rules of my various invented languages, and that keeps it pretty consistent. But when I was starting out, I didn't really have a whole lot of guidelines, so I was doing everything from anagrams of real words to sort of semi-dyslexic misreadings of actual words and names, and I just said, I like the way this alternate spelling looks. I'm going to go with that. But as I said, I've gotten a lot more disciplined with that over the years.
So you write this, and you're finally showing it to your parents, and they committed to it in a really exceptional way. Why do you think they made that leap with you to say, this is a family business? We are pouring everything into this. That's why that extraordinary leap.
I'm almost the age my father was when I gave them Aragon. And looking back on it now, having being closer in age to him now, I really have come to appreciate, what an amazing thing it was that they did. I think part of it is that their whole lives, they were always looking for things to work on as a family business. And the hard part is figuring out what it is that you can do that someone else isn't already doing. And, they tried a million different things. They were really good at marketing and doing, this job and that job. I mean, I could go through a list of odd jobs they held over the years. But they always put family first. And part of the reason they were self-employed was so that, they weren't having to just run off to jobs every single day and not see their kids. So when I gave them Aragon, there was enough promise in it. I think they immediately saw that there was a potential there for this to be what we had always been looking for, to work on together. And, it's not like they took it from me. That's something I wanted as well. It was always a joint goal. And fortunately for us, that worked out.
Oh, it absolutely did. But what I loved about the story is it wasn't, I think like when people started to hear about you on a very large scale, it looked like it was just, hey, here's this really young person who just popped on the scene with instant fame, and that just wasn't it.
No, I mean, like with Aragon. So Aragon came out with Random House released their edition of Aragon in 2003. So last year was actually the 20th anniversary of the hardcover publication. But I had the original idea for Aragon in 1997. So from when I was, started the world building to when Random House published the book was half a decade. So, as you say, people saw Aragon get released by Random House, and it immediately jumped on the bestseller list and sold a bunch of copies and did really well. They're like, well, overnight success for this, teenager, and people started growling about that. And I totally understand. But what they didn't see was I had been working on that book, both with the writing and editing and then the promotion, literally every day for 5 years. And, if you pick one project and work at it with all of your motivation and intelligence and familial support for half a decade, you're probably going to get something out of it. Maybe it won't be Aragon, but you're going to make some progress.
Yeah, you'll move that dial. You said something early in that comment that I want to play off of. People began growling about it when it started selling really well.
Oh yeah, there were quite a few people who were pretty grouchy about it. I remember the first Comic-Con I did, and I had this huge signing line, and there were some authors there who were quite a bit older and more well established who were next to me who didn't have the same signing lines, and the thing is because I was so young, I didn't realize how unusual that experience was. Because from my point of view, well, you write your first book and it debuts on the New York Times list. That's just how it goes, right? Of course it's not. But you don't get perspective until you live longer and you get to see more of what life is actually like. So I look back on it and I totally understand why some authors were just a little bit askance at what was happening with me in my books, because I get it. It's not a normal experience for that to happen. But I will say that pretty much everyone in the industry was absolutely lovely and supportive. Terry Brooks, especially, was a mentor to me and took me under his wing. The negative experiences were few and far between, but overall, just absolutely wonderful and positive.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the greatest things about the industry. Most people are just amazing in this industry. But so here you are, Random House hasn't picked it up, and you are every day going from school to school to school and then getting on the road and heading toward the next school and having to be on your game all the time. Mm-hmm. At that time, what was your biggest dream?
My biggest dream, which I thought I was not going to accomplish, was that I could somehow get published and maybe sell 100,000 books someday. Because I'd done the math and I was like, okay, if I want to have a family, if I want to make a decent living, it's like, man, if I could sell 100,000 books, man, I could tell stories for the rest of my life, and I don't need a lot of money, and that would be a lot of money, and boy, man, if I could sell 100,000 books. And it wasn't even selling the books. The dream was to be able to continue to tell stories. That was the dream. And I wasn't sure that was ever going to be possible. I mean, because also once we started promoting Aragon, I wasn't able to work on the second book and actually do any sort of creative writing for, well, it was like 2 years, almost 3 years. I wasn't really doing a whole lot of writing because it was all promotion and editing then with Random House and so forth and so on.
Yeah, and so it was just, I'm sure, just percolating and kind of evolving. And as you're building, is there a connection between that Viking hut that you build and the worlds you start to build, or was it just sheer boredom and nothing more?
Sheer boredom. I mean, I like the aesthetics of a lot of fantasy. If I had the tools and the craftsmanship and the time, that's the sort of thing I would have attempted to build and create myself. The problem with having, I think, artistic goals is so often you just end up frustrated because you're shooting for things that maybe your talents or equipment don't allow you to achieve. One of the things I've been most gratified with getting older is getting some of the skills I've needed to accomplish what I want, and then also, having the money to actually buy something like a handsaw instead of chopping trees down with a claw hammer. The right tools really do make the job a lot easier.
Go figure. Um, can you talk about boredom a little bit, and where you see the value in that, not only for just anybody who creates, like why
Mm.
we need to be bored.
It's essential because your brain starts wandering and you get frustrated with nothing to do. So then you try to find something to do. And that will often lead to some form of creation. You know, if you're constantly hopping on your phone and browsing through different apps or social media or playing, little mobile games that fill up those dead minutes and hours, then your brain is not just going to drift along and make connections that it wouldn't otherwise make. And that, because I think that is what creativity is. It's making connections between things that otherwise seem disconnected. And only you are going to be able to make certain connections in your brain versus someone else. But you have to give it the chance. People seriously underestimate how bored I was when I started Aragon. Like imagine living in a rural part of the country with no internet, no television, barely any radio reception, and you don't drive, and the library is a 30-minute drive away, and you've read all the fantasy books in the library because it's just a little old Carnegie library. So, really, the boredom is so supreme that you're going to go out and dig a 9-foot hole in the backyard. And I don't really get bored these days because I have so many story ideas and so much work, and I have a family now. So it's harder to sometimes get into that state, but I do try to give myself time to just sit and daydream. And I have to remind myself that I'm not wasting time. It is productive, creative work and useful for my brain to just have that time where I'm literally laying on a couch or sitting outside watching the clouds go by. And sometimes it's just standing in a hot shower. And I get so many good ideas in the shower. I think it's something about the hypnotic quality of the water. But yes, walking is another big one. I got lots of good ideas while walking.
Mm. I think it's always important to know our creative spaces so that when the well is running a little low, we know to go back
Hmm.
to those. So the fact that you're like, yep, these are my places, I think that's so important.
Well, and
Um,
the problem though is ideas are easy and cheap in a lot of ways. It's the execution that takes time and effort and skill. And coming up with an idea is not a problem. It's then developing it properly and the time it takes. I've got more ideas than I have years in my life, so ideas are not the problem. It's everything else.
you're right. You're right. And the execution is, in the end, anybody can have a great idea, is what we do with it. Um, once Random House released this book, and I remember because I was trying to write and I was miserable and awful at it, and I remember when your name was what everybody was talking about in the field, in the industry, because it was such a breakout thing. It was such an unusual
Mm.
experiment and experience for people, and it was great. Aragon was an amazing, epic story, and so it was this big thing. How did you stay grounded?
Uh, Well, I mean, I may not at times. Again, it's hard to sort of understand how strange an experience like that is when you're going through it as a teenager and then in your early 20s. But two of the things that really helped were continuing to live in Montana. So I really didn't have a large social circle before getting published, and I certainly didn't after getting published, aside from, my work colleagues. So I wasn't having to deal with some of the weirdness that I think a lot of people might if they have a breakout success and they're, in a big city and have a lot of people around them. Also, my family did a really good job of shielding me from the attention and some of the weirdness along the way. Downside of that is perhaps it took a little longer to grow up than maybe it should have, at least in some ways. I mean, it's like I was working and being productive, but there were quite a few life experiences I didn't have until later in life, once I sort of stepped away from the writing for a while and said, okay, I've done my time in the trenches. I need to, go out and live life on my own terms now.
Mm. And so did you do that? Did you quit writing or just quit publishing for a while? Or what did you do when you were
No, I've never stopped writing. Went out and traveled quite a bit on my own, lived in a number of places, and just, tried to actually live a normal life as much as I could without having a day job. So
Yeah.
that was helpful.
I think that's actually a brilliant choice to have made. Now for you, where do you find the greatest joy as a writer? Like where's your play place as a writer?
Funnily enough, it hasn't changed since I was 15. When I read a good story or when I watch a great movie or listen to a great piece of music, it gives me an emotional reaction. I get a tingle. I get the literal tingle down my spine. And unfortunately, there's very few stories that actually give me that response. So I have to read a lot and watch a lot to get that. But those that do tend to shape who I am and really stick with me. And my happy place as a writer is in thinking of scenes that give me that feeling, or I think they'll give me that feeling, and then building the structure around them required to make it all make sense to the reader so that we can get that experience. And then getting to actually write that stuff is incredibly rewarding. It always affects me emotionally. With To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, for example, the very last scene in the book, the very last chapter, was one of those things that affected me deeply emotionally and was kind of why I wrote the book, among other reasons. And when I finally came to write it, it's nerve-wracking when you build up the meaning and importance of a scene in your head, because then you really want to do a good job and you want to make sure the emotions come through the way you want them to come through. So it's always a bit of a higher wire act, but it's also exciting too. And if you think you've done it and then you hear from readers that it has the effect you want, then it's incredibly rewarding.
What do you hear from your readers? What kind of fan feedback has always stayed with you?
I didn't get this at first. It took a couple of years, but hearing from people who got into reading because of Aragon and got into fantasy and sometimes even got into writing, and then hearing from people who, maybe were in a tough place in their life and something in the story got them through that or gave them a bit of a bright spot that kept them going. Incredibly touching to hear that. And I think as a writer, all I ever hoped was that my writing might someday, affect someone emotionally, and to hear that it did and in a positive way I think that's about as good as it gets. Also, as my readers have gotten older, I've met a number of people who've named their children after the characters, and that just continues to blow my mind. I mean, there are Aragons out there are Saphiras and Arias, and quite a few Rorans. It's an amazing honor.
No, that's got to be just so extraordinary. And to realize that this thing that started as an idea in your head now it's crossing generations and continuing to impact lives.
Backstory is brought to you by StoryCon. StoryCon is the evolution of Teen Author Boot Camp, the largest combined writing camp and fan expo in the Intermountain West. Join us on February 21st and 22nd, 2025 at the Salt Palace Convention Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. The event will feature keynote speeches and masterclasses from internationally best-selling authors like Jeff Kinney, Neil Shusterman, Shannon Hale, Marissa Meyer, and many more. Other activities include an exhibitor hall that's free to the public, writing contests, and the Operation Literacy Awards Gala. Visit storycon.org today to register. That's StoryCon.org. Hurry, masterclasses have a limited space.
In general, what do you think fantasy reading does for readers? Why fantasy? Why is that an empowering genre or an important one?
I mean, it's hard to say. I can only speak for myself, and I read fantasy because I very much enjoy a sense of awe and wonder. I love those magical moments where you do feel a sense of magic. Ursula Le Guin was really good at that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, getting to visit another world and another culture and have a grand old adventure in a mythological sense almost, the way we, used to tell stories in myths and legends.
You mentioned, like diving into these fantasy worlds and things. How do you build your worlds?
Well, as with the names, I've gotten a lot more disciplined with it over the years, just because it saves me effort on the back end. The way I would go about creating a new world now, to start with, I probably will have a general sense of what type of world I'm trying to create. Is it like medieval style, Europe? Is it something else? So whatever, there's a general sense of what I'm aiming for. Then the first big step for me would be to identify what is it that makes this different from reality on a very base level, whether that's technology, physics or magic. Basically, how are you breaking physics as we know it, or how are you differing from physics as we know it, whether it's with magic or technology? And the reason I put that up front is because what is physically possible within your setting is going to determine so much of what is done in your setting, whether that's technology, religion, societal stuff. It's going to be based on what's physically possible. So I do spend a lot of time working out the implications of whatever that difference is. For example, in my science fiction books, faster than light travel is possible with a certain piece of technology. So what are the implications of that? What are all the ins and outs and nuances of that, and how does it actually work? Because again, it determines what my characters are able to do with the technology they have available. Once I feel like I have a good feel for that and how it would also be affecting and deployed by the society, then I'll spend some more time thinking about the society itself, the general setting. And then from there, I'll work down into, are there other species? Are there other plants? What's the effect of all those? And then get down to the individual character level. And then, of course, the events, the plot itself. So there really isn't like a sharp line dividing plot from world building for me, because it's the same thing like with people talk about character-driven stories versus plot-driven stories. Well, what happens to the characters shape who they are, and who they are shape what they do, which shapes what happens. Same thing with world building. The setting shapes what's possible, and what people do in the setting will also shape what's in the world itself and how the world evolves. And it just kind of goes back and forth fluidly.
Do you write it down, or do you just store that in your head?
Oh, I absolutely write it down. I do all of my world building in notebooks by hand. And then when I have definitive answers on whatever topic I'm working on, then I transfer it into the computer, and I keep as rigorous track of it as I can, because there's just too many details for me to, keep in my head. Just even from the inheritance cycle alone. I mean, I think there's over 500 named characters in the inheritance cycle, something like that. I can't keep track of all that all the time.
Do you... When at what point does the map come into play? Is that early or middle or late in the world building process?
I like a map pretty early in the process these days, because the physical location and the physical distances shape so much of what can and can't do. So when creating the map from scratch, I will usually let the plot dictate the positions of a number of the major locations. It's like, I know I need to be here. I know I need to be there. Let's try to shape the map so I'm not making life hard for myself, and I'm not messing up the plot I want to tell. But after that point, what's there on the page with the map is going to shape the course of the story.
Have you ever, in an early, like book one, when you're building all of this world and creating the map and doing all of that, and then you get to book two or three or four, have you ever looked back on a choice you made for that first novel's world and now you're stuck with it and you had to work around it? Has that ever happened?
A couple of small things, nothing big so far. I actually had that kind of happen within Aragon itself because I started Aragon with no map because I felt like a well-written book shouldn't rely on a map for readers to know where the characters are and what they're doing. And I still think that's true. But of course, maps are nice to have. The problem was when I was writing the book, I realized I was getting lost in the book. I was losing track of exact places and distances and that sort of thing. So I spent a good amount of time and created a map for the world. And I thought, okay, this is all I'm going to need. And I kept writing the book. And then I got about halfway through the book and realized I'd already covered most of the map and I needed more space. So I took my map, which ended up being the western half of the world of Aragon, and I slapped down, it was just a piece of printer paper with the one half. So I slapped down another piece of printer paper, and I didn't want to take days to draw another map because I just wanted to keep writing. So I just scribbled in forest, mountains. Okay, I'm done. And because I was moving so fast, the mountains I drew in were 10 times the height of my western mountains. And I looked at it after a while and I thought, I wonder what would happen if they really were that tall. And that's where I got my giant dwarf mountains. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but if you read the books, it makes sense. So the maps really do shape the story.
That is the coolest map origin story ever. Uh, you described it during Aragon, you were very methodical in your approach, and you strike me as a very methodical person overall.
Mm.
Are you still that way as you write? That it's, this is what I'm working on, now I'm going to move to this. Are you very thoughtful, or do you ever just see what happens?
There's always some discovery when writing a book, and you can't pre-plan. I can't pre-plan everything, so sometimes I have a pretty good general idea of what needs to happen, but the specifics get worked out on the page just based off the very sort of A causes B causes C sort of logic. But the more I pre-plan a novel, the easier I find it to write and the better the final product tends to be. So I really do try to take at least 2 weeks and often longer. Quite often, sometimes it's something that happens over the course of years while I'm working on other projects.
Have you ever had a character, because, in chapter one, we think we know the characters, but we
Yeah.
really don't, where you learn something new about them as
A-
you are writing?
Absolutely. And it happened with all of the characters in the inheritance cycle, I think. Working on working on a series gives you more of a chance to know the characters than over a single book. And you just can't get that experience writing a single book. When you live with the characters for just about a decade, essentially, yeah, you do find out all sorts of things about them that you just didn't think of when you first imagined their characteristics back in the day. So, with Aragon, with Roran, with Ari and Murtagh, all of the main characters, there were times when, even though I'd plotted out the story of the series, where I had to go back and re-examine my assumptions because what I had originally intended to do with those characters no longer made sense for who they actually were. As a major example of this, I have my character of Murtagh and his dragon Thorn. I originally was going to, spoiler alert everyone, I was going to kill them in the last book of the inheritance cycle. And thematically, it made a lot of sense to take them out in the last book. But it just felt cruel and unnecessary when I finally got to the final book. And because I didn't do that, I now have an entire book starring those two characters, which has been out for a year and doing very well.
Wow, that's I'm glad that they were saved, that last minute reprieve. Christopher, do you have any advice for young authors in particular, or
Mm.
any aspiring authors at all? What would you advise them?
Go read some books on story structure. Story by McKee is one I've mentioned, and I'll mention it again. Highly recommended. Style by F.L. Lucas is the best book on prose style that I have ever read. There's a book called Shakespeare's Metrical Art, which is the best book on poetic techniques that I have ever read. And then along with all that, I would say that the one thing I wish I had really understood when I was starting out would be that just because you write a bad word or sentence or paragraph or scene, chapter, or character or storyline, or even a bad first draft, that doesn't make you a bad writer. If you look at examples of editing that very well-known, well-established authors have released, people have been working for 30, 40 years and won every award you can imagine. And if you look at examples of the editing that they've released, they're still covering their pages with red pencil marks. They're still ripping their prose apart. So it is a natural part of the process to go back and improve things and fix things, and for things to need improving and fixing. It's very hard to get it right the first time around. I mean, you're trying to juggle imagining who the characters are, imagining the world, imagining the story, imagining the tone, and then controlling the language and the pacing all at the same time. It's like 50 things at once. So a lot of times it needs polishing and revision, especially when you're learning the craft for the first time. So just because something doesn't work on the first version doesn't make you a bad writer. What would make you a bad writer is if you're not willing to go back and fix it. So find people in your life who can help provide you with some valuable feedback. Make sure it's not people who are tearing you down. Because again, this isn't personal. This is just about the writing itself. Doesn't make you a bad person if you wrote a sentence that doesn't work. And that constructive feedback and being open to it will help you grow as a writer like never before. And if you can accept that revision and editing is a natural part of the process, you lose your fear of failure. You're going to be willing to experiment and jump off cliffs that you weren't before, with the knowledge that, yeah, you might have to rewrite your draft. Yeah, you might have to reconstruct your story. Yeah, you might have to do X, Y, Z. So what? It's just work. There's nothing to be scared of with work.
Some of the best advice ever. That's fantastic. Do you have a current passion project? And if so, can you give us any hints or insights?
Well, it's funny.
And the answer is no. That's okay, but I've got to try.
Well, I just released a teaser on social media to all my fans, teasing and actually giving a little bit of a preview of the next book in the world of Aragon. And I did that because the Kickstarter we've been running for a collectible Saphira figurine, Saphira is the dragon in the world of Aragon, it hit over $1 million raised so far. Actually, we're at 1.3. So as a thank you, I released a little teaser of the setup for the next book. So I'm excited for writing that. I'm also excited for writing more books in my science fiction universe. And Disney Plus is currently working on a big budget television adaptation of Aragon, which I'm producing and co-writing. So there's a lot going on, and I'm just hoping to sort of hunker down and really focus on creating and telling a bunch of the stories that have been living in my head for the last 15 years.
That sound that you may hear is millions of fans cheering at that, just to know there's more coming from your pen that we can look forward to. That is so exciting, and to be with Disney Plus on a show, even more exciting as well. If listeners want to learn more about your books, where should they go?
The best place would be my website, paolini.net. If you're interested in all things Christopher. If you're interested in the sci-fi side of things, I recommend my website, fractalverse.net, which also has a free interactive novella set after the events of To Sleep, as well as tons of concept art that I commissioned, and it's a cool website. Also, you can find me on all the social media platforms, usually under @Paolini or @Christopher_Paolini. There's also a great community over on Reddit at the Aragon subreddit. So, bounce around, come visit me at any one of those places. And it's a wonderful, positive fandom and community. And I'm very proud of all the readers for making it that way. And I can't wait to create more stuff for them.
I just have one final question for you, Christopher. Do you believe that for you, that the best is yet to come?
I hope so. But I'm also well aware that when I am no longer for this earth, that my gravestone will likely read, "Here lies the author of Aragon." And I'm okay with that. I've had an absolutely amazing experience with these books over the years. I continue to be humbled every day by people's love for them. And I am continually grateful that it's allowed me to do the one thing I wanted to do in life aside from family, which was tell stories. I am incredibly grateful and happy with the experience I've had so far. And to everyone who's read my books, I just say thank you. And as the elves themselves would say, Trasterndy Onofelduin.
Perfect. To everyone, the Backstory podcast is sponsored by Operation Literacy. On February 21st and 22nd, 2025, they will be putting on StoryCon in Salt Lake City, the largest literacy event to ever take place in Utah.
And I'll be there.
There's the spoiler. He will be one of our featured presenters, along with so many of your other favorite authors. Be sure to check them out. This event is expected to sell out. Get your tickets now at storycon.org. Every one of us has a backstory. It's the life that happens to us before we begin happening to life. It will mold you and form you into the amazing person you are, which means your story will always be important. And your story, Christopher, has been incredibly important for all of us. Thank you so much for being on this podcast here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Backstory. If you'd like to enjoy more episodes, visit us at storycon.org/backstory. That's StoryCon.org/backstory.